India will play a fundamental role in the process, because India has plenty to say about the rules of national world order. India doesn't want them to disintegrate, I believe. As long as Mr. Putin decides it will be. The point is that we are fighting back and defending our country, and as long as he keeps on trying to destroy our country, we will defend our country. The fact of the matter is, we certainly are aspiring to be part of NATO because we see this as only guarantee of our territorial integrity and security. And Russia has just proven us right. I believe that there were steps that were made by Indian government to try and understand what is happening here and try to take a stance which truly explains its position to Russia. That this imperialism, naked imperialism, is not acceptable in this day and age.
He's 27 years old. He's Ukraine's youngest member of parliament. And when Russia invaded Ukraine last year, he, along with his colleagues, picked up the guns to fight back. He has been photographed patrolling or walking on the streets of Kyiv with a Kalashnikov in his hand. And I'm happy to welcome Sviatoslav Yurash to our podcast this week, He is in India right now. He's in New Delhi right now. He's come to take part in the Raisina Dialogue, which is, of course, organized by the Ministry of External Affairs, along with in coordination with the Observer Research Foundation. He's here as a young fellow who's going to be there for the entire duration of this conference on geopolitical and very important conference as far as India is concerned. In Hindustan Times podcast today, we talk to him about what he thinks will take to end this war, which is now into its second year. And finally, the latest updates from the battlefields, because he's really, as he was just telling me before we started this conversation, he's been fighting this summer down with the soldiers in the trenches. So, Sviatoslav, welcome to Hindustan Times. The consensus was wrecked at the G20 finance ministers meeting over the Ukraine issue. How do you view this lack of consensus? Because very clearly, there are people who are absolutely, or there are countries who are absolutely not willing to term this as a crime, as something that should be condemned.
For us, G20 is a fundamental forum in which we need to tell the story of what's happening in Ukraine. Because the fact of the matter is, it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the international rules of order. The fact of the matter is, if big countries can invade smaller countries to enforce whatever historical theories they have, then the world doesn't work as it is. And we don't come together to discuss the global progress, we come to fight every single time. And if the biggest country on earth is allowed to take over the biggest country in Europe, many more countries around the world that have claims in other countries, problems with other countries, or assumptions about other countries will try to do that as well. And that will cause much more horror, death all around the world. So the point of Ukraine's engagement with G20 is not simply to discuss our issue, though. Our aspirations, it's not just in terms of European Union and NATO. I would be as ambitious to say that as far as engaging G20 and making Ukraine a nation we dreamed about back when we started the revolution, back when we were growing up, was that nation that can be in that forum, engaging with the whole world, not just the Western countries, about the future of the world.
You know, to be fair, it all began with Russia claiming, and began much before February 22, before the
almost
invasion.
10 years now.
Yeah, it's been almost 10 years since this began. And the overriding rationale of Putin has always been, he said that he fears the presence of NATO on his borders, and he does not want NATO on his borders. Ukraine is very ambitious to join the NATO. So there is some semblance of, and China has also supported Putin as saying that, NATO is sort of flanking its borders, and therefore there is some semblance, there seems to be at least some semblance of self-preservation that Putin is talking about here. How would how would you respond to that?
I find that this Russian claim lacks essence, because the point is this invasion, let's forget about Ukraine for a second, this invasion started the fact that northern countries that border Russia started the process of joining NATO. So NATO only expanded, and the border that Russia had already with NATO expanded immensely. And the point is that all these claims are vacuous. The fact of the matter is we certainly are aspiring to be part of NATO because we see this as only guarantee of our territorial integrity and security. And Russia has just proven us right, because when not being part of NATO, we get invaded and we have all this hell that started in Ukraine. The fact of the matter is all these claims, Mr. Putin, have no bearing behind them, because we will know we're close joining NATO. Mr. Putin, his very basic point that he talks about for 10 years, well, for many more years, so all the years he's in power, is that he believes Ukraine and Russia should be one country. And again, it's a question to Ukrainians whether they believe that too, and they don't. Every single poll and measurement since our independence referendum in 91 has shown the Ukrainians in their absolute majority. The referendum was 91% of Ukrainians voted for independence, want their own country, want their own state. And the more Mr. Putin has done aggressive steps, occupation of Ukrainian Crimea, the war in Donbass that he started in 2014, all the way in those times, the war starting, it didn't start 24 February, it started way back when. The point is that all these steps were simply pushing all the Ukrainians to understand that their only secure future they can have is not with Russia.
All right. Since we are in India, I'm going to ask you this question, because India is also the host of the G20, and India has pointedly not condemned the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine either at the United Nations in successive...
Bit of correction there.
Right. But they've condemned... Prime Minister Modi has gone and told Putin to his face
That's very important.
that this is not an era
That's
of war.
very important.
That has happened. But at the UN resolutions, India has not condemned the invasion
Abstained.
because of its own foreign policy priorities,
Yes.
right? How do you, as the Ukrainian, view that?
I believe that there were steps that were made by Indian government to try and understand what is happening here and try to take a stance which truly explains its position to Russia. That this imperialism, naked imperialism, is not acceptable in this day and age. So the point is, we still need to make many more steps to build the closer relationship that we certainly aspire to and we think we present the reasons for. But the point here is that, again, the steps are taking place, but there are many more that need to happen.
How do you, because when we last spoke, and that was an online thing, you were still back in Kiev at that point in time, what you said that you expect Prime Minister Modi to play some sort of a role in bringing a resolution to whatever's happening. Now, China has said that it came up with a peace proposal which Putin has rejected. Do you think going forward, India can play a role in that direction? And what sort of a role?
As the largest population in the world, as the country that will definitely decide the 21st century and its destiny, India will play a fundamental role in the process, because India has plenty to say about the rules of national world order. India doesn't want them to disintegrate, I believe, because again, many more conflicts will be prone in every region of the world, especially the region of the Asian continent. The fact of the matter is that basically when you look at Indian policies, it has been inconsistent about the borders to be respected, sovereignty as well. And the point here is that as far as Indian steps in relation with Russia, it is transforming, and I hope it transforms faster. But it is our job in Ukraine to come here, talk, explain, tell the reality of what is happening and the consequences of that to the world. And I believe that Mr. Modi's words to Mr. Putin is not just some small incidents. It's very important that Mr. Putin understands that his actions there impact his relationships in other places, especially relationships with India. And he basically takes great pride in the fact that he is keeping the relationship with the countries around the world which are not in the West in that sense. But the point is that is also being changed by what he has done in Ukraine, because the horror that he engulfed a European continent in Ukraine is something that will haunt Russia and Mr. Putin for innumerable number of years ahead of us.
Right. On NATO and your NATO ambitions, I have another question. And I should have asked it when I was talking to you about NATO. The NATO boss,
Jens
he has,
Stoltenberg.
yeah, the Stoltenberg, he has recently said that in the near term at least, it doesn't look like Ukraine is going to get that NATO membership. There is obviously some level of trepidation as far as Putin's response has been concerned, but he's talked about long term. In the long term, Ukraine will become a part of NATO. So at least your near term ambitions, because your president Zelensky has constantly been asking, for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO membership. You've just talked about it. How do you view this view by the NATO boss?
He is just voicing the reality of the fact that NATO countries are discussing various different ways they can engage as far as repelling Russian invasion. The goal of ours is to have the long-term security that NATO provides European countries. The countries that are far smaller than Ukraine and immeasurably smaller than Russia on their border, part of the former Soviet Union, are getting invaded by Russia because they are in NATO. So for us, it is fundamental to remember that long-term the only guarantee of our security is NATO. But it's not just about NATO. The Quad alliance here that is certainly shaping up, and India is taking a far more leading role in that, is an example of those alliances which keep global stability from disintegrating. I believe NATO is one of those alliances. And for us, it is increasingly understandable that there is no other way but to aspire for NATO. And more than that, it's in our constitution that we should basically make all the steps required to join NATO. Because again, ever since 2014, Russia has made every effort to convince Ukrainians that the option that we must pursue is the integration in that alliance, because that provides the security we need.
You just praised Prime Minister Modi's words that this is not an era of war. NATO is a military alliance, so to speak. If this is not an era of war, what is the need of a military alliance?
To keep and deter the reality of. So first, let's look at the history. So NATO was actually divesting itself from Europe. European countries were living in the understanding that war is impossible in Europe. And the fact of the matter is the American contingent in Europe was shrinking to almost nothing. But then Russia started to invade, Russia started to threaten. And ever since 2014, he reversed that. And the policy has been very much to understand that if NATO is weak, Putin will start more and more hell that will be consuming a lot of parts around the world. So the point for us is that basically military alliance exists to prevent war. That aggressors know that if they attack, if they bully, they will have a response not just of one country or two countries. They'll have a response of a big bloc. That's hopefully the story of the Quad as it's shaping up to the future. But the question of NATO, it has been proven right. And I just must mention that as far as joining NATO, NATO has members that have been split, and Germany was a part of NATO ever since its creation. And the point there is that basically half of Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union. And basically the story there is when Germany unified, it became part of NATO too. So the story for Ukraine, I believe that membership of NATO is not something that is prevented by this, but is more necessary because of what's happening.
All right. Putin has nuclear weapons. Russia has nuclear weapons. Even a small country like North Korea is sort of with its nuclear, because it's nuclear weapons armed, it sort of puts the fear of God in a lot of neighboring countries, and puts the world on tenterhooks every time Kim Jong-un so much as sneezes. Having said that, Ukraine earlier gave up its nuclear weapons. At the time of this war, do you believe that move should not have happened? You should not have given up your nuclear weapons?
I believe
Would that have made you more powerful to combat?
I believe that era was the era of hope, that we are leaving this competition, this struggle, and this potential for world-destroying conflict. But sadly, we were proven wrong. The story of that, it's not so much a story about Ukraine and nukes, it's a story about international agreements, because we didn't just give up our nuclear weaponry. We signed a treaty with guarantors that are all Security Council members, and they promised that if Ukrainian territorial sovereignty or integrity is infringed, they would have a response. We discovered in 2014 just how little of that response it was there. And that's why, as far as the conversation about the Security Council as an instrument that exists in the form it does right now, whether it should evolve, is something that Ukraine is certainly involved in, and discussion about the UN and general inspiration in that direction. So, because we see how these institutions, when again, the biggest country on earth tries to consume the biggest country in Europe, do not work as intended. I'm extremely glad that the alliances still helped us in so many different ways, but this agreement, which is landmark, again, third biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, given up, and for the promise of support, and then no support we saw in 2014, and we have step by step evolved that, and only the horror unleashed by Mr. Putin on 24th February finally convinced to do the world to do this, that, and the other to resist that invasion.
So 2 questions emanating from your answer there. One, and that should be a short one, does Ukraine regret giving up the nuclear weapons when they did in the 90s?
It's a very vibrant discussion direction. I mean, the reality is, one thing is having the nuclear weapons. Another thing is actually utilizing them, maintaining them, and having them as an instrument. And the point is that era of hope, the big question was, against who do you have that nuclear weaponry? I mean, we had the referendum, getting our independence from Soviet Union, and recognizing each other with the new Russian Federation. And hopefully, again, the idea of a war in Europe, when I was growing up, seemed an impossibility. Idea of a war in our country, even more so. A war with Russia, that seemed as far-fetched concept as possible. But Mr. Putin has proven all of our assumptions wrong, time and time again. And our job right now is to examine our past and think whether we can have gotten something stronger as far as the alliances and the guarantees and not just promises, but actual legislation focusing in the power of law, the efforts that should be done by the world's greatest powers as far as Ukrainian sovereignty in the future.
You said that there is a certain level of regret. The other question is about the support from the West. You've also said that you've not had the kind of support from the West you expected in 2014. In 2022, you've had that support. The West has come, backed you up, but not soon enough, would you say?
Well, so first, in 2014, the reality is the shock I described about the war is not just my shock. It's a shock by many Western leaders who were very much seeing the world change in its perspective of where the global security threats lie. And the pivot to Asia, of Obama administration, famously so, and many more steps in that direction. But the point here is that as far as what's happened there, many, I believe, from what I saw at that point, of world's leaders were caught back-footed in this situation, and they did not know what to respond with. They have certainly sanctioned this, that, and the other. They have certainly deprived Russia of the possibility to present itself as a great power, pushing it out of G7. Not to mention the general consequences for various Russian industrial links, which are tying up to many different defense consortiums in the West, but it's a separate, long conversation. But as far as the 2022, the story here is that different intelligence services were predicting the Russian invasion, and they did not give us much of a chance, much of a time frame in which we can defend ourselves. But we did. The reality is many things came together and have proven that Ukrainians believe in their nation and want to have their nation, and they're willing to die for their nation, even though they weren't soldiers before. I mean, you mentioned my story. My story is I didn't have military training. I didn't have the army experience. But when I was caught in Kiev on 24th February, I knew that I wouldn't leave for nothing. I knew that I will do everything possible, both individually and in terms of different friendships I developed as in my life before the parliament, during the parliament, to try and assemble what I can to try and resist the takeover of our ancient capital. So the story of that is that in that moment, the whole nation was coming together to resist in every way. You saw those pictures. I mean, these pictures of people just in the village coming on the street and blocking the road for Russian tanks.
Right.
With nothing, because again, this is whole nation coming together because we don't want to be destroyed. The Russian plan as it is panning out now from various sources, was basically to consume us. We don't want to be destroyed. And it's not my words. Mr. Putin has made hours-long speeches before the invasion, delineating that point. He was calling Ukraine Lenin's mistaken, this, that, the other. He has those theories that he talked about throughout many, many years of his presidency. And the point here is that we were proving him wrong because we exist and we want to continue building our nation and achieving the dream that we have of prosperous, independent, sovereign and integral Ukraine.
About the heavy weaponry aid that your president, many of you have repeatedly asked the Western nations, the United States, Germany, France, to supply the heavy weaponry, the tanks, the air defense systems at a much faster rate than what you have got them. It's been a year later that the heavy weaponry, the real guns have really arrived. Do you believe had they arrived sooner, this war would have been shorter?
Again, the problem is certainly, if we had many more instruments, we would be able to defend more effectively and battle on more effectively. But the story is that we basically had to prove ourselves, sadly. The belief in Ukrainian strength was not as great as what we've seen after the battles of Kiev, of the north of Ukraine, the east and south were won, because we time and time again are proving that we can not just defend ourselves but also win. And as far as the heavy weaponry, I mean, the request for that is for a very simple reason. One thing is talking about the attack as the Russians are doing it. I mean, they have human wave tactics in which they're sending people after people after people. And the point is, what we look at, I imagine, is the combined arms theory, in which all these instruments of war provide for a chance to actually secure your land and not sacrifice as greatly in the process. Russians don't care about people, as we are seeing, and again, as the intelligence services all over the world is reporting when it looks at Russian casualties. And we do. And that's why we're preparing to liberate our country with these instruments.
Okay. You are saying it could have arrived sooner, would have ended the war sooner, deterred the Russians from going as far as they did. But the fact also remains that you are dependent on heavy weaponry from the West, from your Western allies. And there is a Putin that side, on the other side, who is, despite your fight back, his onslaught has only increased. And right, especially after the second, after entering the second year, I think this is the week that the war entered its second year. Do you believe how much Russia has enough arsenal in its bucket? And now apparently there are reports and talks and some intel that China is willing to supply heavy weaponry and tanks, etc., to Russia as they need them. Boots on the ground are clearly necessary in a war of this nature. How long do you see this war continuing?
It's as long as Mr. Putin decides it will be. The point is that we are fighting back and defending our country. And as long as he keeps on trying to destroy our country, we will defend our country. So as soon as he gets out of Ukraine, lets us decide our future, the war ends. That's the basic narrative that we need to talk about, because the story is that Mr. Putin has done unspeakable crimes, not just to Ukraine, but to the international idea of the world coming together in any way, and to award him for that by any kind of delay, a pause, a chunk of territory, and say, well, you killed these people, destroyed all these homes, demolished all these lives, and now you get this as your reward. It's something that's impermissible, because again, that is teaching many of the autocracies around the world the wrong lessons. And the point for us is we're defending our country. So basically, no matter how much time
Russia... So if he doesn't want to stop and he continues,
we will fight on.
You will obviously keep fighting back. How long do you think a war of this nature should continue? Don't you think there should be...
It shouldn't happen. I mean, if you want to it shouldn't have happened. But the story is that Mr. Putin has chosen this war. I mean, he talks about it many times over. I mean, he is not a young man.
But why not sit on a negotiating table? And
we have often negotiated. Well, we had negotiations for all these years from 2014 to 24th February in the Minsk format. The story of that is we were trying to build steps in which we can finalize the conflict in the East and try to reintegrate the East and to finish up the terrible situation that the Russian invasion there has happened in 2014. But the story is that we weren't advancing because the Russians weren't interested in trying to finish this. They were trying to use this to force us on other concessions in different ways, territorial and sovereignty, deciding basically our future for us, to make this a permanent check on our ability to choose our own future. The point is that we still were keeping those negotiations. The first speeches right after the invasion, before the invasion, the story was that basically our request was to come back to the table. But the story is that Mr. Putin wanted to showcase to the world his military might. The reality is he's shown his military impotence.
But the fact of the matter is that there was a peace deal on the table as early as in April 2022.
There wasn't this deal. I mean, Russia refused it every single time. And we were trying to basically.
Okay, according to an interview given by the Israeli Prime Minister at that time, he said that that the peace deal was nixed by the West because they did not want. And not by Russia.
It's many assumptions there, but the reality of what I can say is that what we had there, those peace deals, is not something Mr. Putin would have accepted, because his idea was very simple. I mean, he says it himself. Idea is not the chunks of Ukraine, not this, that, or the other. It's to take over Ukraine. It's the ambition that Russia has had, and is fighting for in the East. And our point is that we will not allow it to happen.
He might have said that at the beginning, but of late, I think he has taken a step back. Do you believe that to be a correct assumption?
I believe in the last week before last, he actually gave a big speech in which he wasn't making any of those points. He wasn't making any consolation. He wasn't making any peace overtures of any sort. He was in any way ratcheting up the militarism and the desire to build whatever dream he has or what Russia should be into a reality. And what I heard in that speech is nothing that says peace to me. And it's not just me. When you listen to various different observers, commentators from the East and the West, they all look at that speech and they see somebody who is trying to be defiant. And despite showing to his nation and to the world that he doesn't have the means to do so.
All right. What does a peace deal look like? What would a peace deal look like for you, for Ukraine? Because you've already said, Kyiv has already said that it was to retake Crimea before this war ends. That might be a point. Do you see that to be a point of divergence with your Western allies? Because that's what many analysts are pointing out, that might cause differences.
The first point is that as far as, in question Crimea, I'm glad to say that India does not recognize the Russian takeovers of any capacity. And we are united. We just had a UN resolution being passed by 144 countries that essentially was talking about the different peace plans. And the peace plan that was accepted as the discussion point there was basically what we presented as well. I mean, the point is not just Chinese peace plan that you mentioned. There are other peace plans that are being provided and shown. There's Zelensky peace plan, which was presented and debated and certainly supported by various different avenues. And for us, it is fundamental to understand that in this peace that we want to see is the peace that cannot be easily broken. And that is something we'll have only if Russia gets out of Ukraine. We don't want anything that isn't ours. We just want our country to choose our own future. That is our goal here. And again, it is easy to understand all around the world because different countries have different histories and they all have that power which assume that they need to join or they want to take them over. For Ukraine, that is Russia. And we want to provide a living rebuke, fighting back in every single way against the ambition that they have for our country.
Going by what you're saying, then a peace deal is not likely to happen anytime soon.
Well, again, it's not the question of our desire for peace. We have desire for peace. We had desire for all these years. We had 8 years of negotiations of trying to figure out a path towards peace. Mr. Putin destroyed the Minsk format, destroyed the negotiations we had, and invaded the largest nation in Europe and is trying to take it and has been proven wrong about the assumptions about Ukraine, about his army, and about the world he's living in.
Right. Thank you so much, Sviatoslav.
Pleasure is all mine.
Thank you for talking to us. Thank you, viewers, for listening to this podcast. But we hope that peace returns soon because a lot of people are dying and are facing ample hardships, and not just in your country or in Russia or Russian soldiers. It's also the entire world is suffering because the economies are in a mess. But thank you so much for talking to us.
Pleasure all mine.
And thank you viewers for watching this podcast.